be talking about how to pack and load your canoe and how to waterproof your gear. When I'm talking about canoeing trips, then I usually talk about multi-day unsupported canoeing, which means that you take all of your gear with you and you do not have any access to shops or resupplies or even roads. So you take everything with you and you have to live with the stuff you have for the length of your trip. So the way you're going to pack your canoe is going to depend on your boat, because the canoes are different. They are different in shape, they have different qualities. Some of them have compartments, some of them don't. Some of them have access to under the seats, but not all of them. So you should acquaint yourself with the boat you will be using, or if it's your own boat, to get to know it really well. Your canoe is going to determine the amount of space you can use, your options for loading it, and your options for securing your things to the boat. For example, if you have these closed compartments which are waterproof in the bow and stern of your boat, you can use them to store items that you need to have waterproof, but items that you don't need throughout the day, because they're usually very inconvenient to access from the boat itself. And you can also use those compartments if you need to bear in mind whether you are loading your boat stern heavy or bow heavy. Then you can use those compartments to balance something out. You should learn to use the shape of your canoe to your advantage. For example, our canoe has these kind of inward curved edges, which means that we use bags that are like the width of the canoe, so we can stuff them snugly under the edges, and that will keep our packs inside the canoe almost whatever situation it is. And also you can, if it's your own boat, you can always consider modifying it to give it more options in, storing and securing your load. For example, we have drilled holes in the side of our canoe, like at the upper edge, to fix bungee cords into our hull. We usually load our stuff into the center, and if we have a lot of stuff, a lot of gear, or if we know that there's going to be white water, then we use the bungee cords to secure it all in place. And it's useful when you know you're going to have rapids or any kind of risk of tipping your boat, because then your stuff will at least stay inside the boat and not get lost. We learned that the hard way the first canoe trip we did with my dad. Basically we capsized, and yes, fortunately we had our friends who just spent some time fishing our stuff out of the river. So the way you pack your canoe will also heavily depend on the conditions you will be canoeing in. For example, will there be white water or rapids, which might create the need to secure your stuff to the boat? Or will there be chance of heavy rain, which might mean some extra waterproofing? Or will you be making frequent stops during the day? This is important in terms of accessibility. What will you need during the day versus what you will need only in the evenings and the mornings? And how many times are you going to get out of the boat during the day to make a stop, and you'll have to take something with you out of the boat. For example, I sit in the bow of the boat, and I have this is kind of my day pack. In here I used to use it as a food bag, but now I'm gonna try to use it as everything I might need during the day. I've got in here my snacks for the day, I've got my food pot, spork, knife. I'm going to put some other, food in here that I might share with others. Then I've got my electronics in here that I might need a battery bank during the day if I'm filming. I've got my sitting pad and my flip-flops. In this pocket here I've got mosquito repellent and these wet wipes, and in here I've got my sun protection and my compass, and yeah, basically this is like my day pack. This fits right under the edge of the bow, like really snugly, so I know that whatever happens, it's probably not going to get, you know, out of that place. So you can think about accessibility, and you don't have to have access to the things that you only need when you're setting up camp in the evening or when you're packing up in the morning. You know, those items can be at the bottom of your boat, just tucked away. It will also increase the chance that they won't get lost or get wet. The conditions you will be canoeing in will also determine whether or not you can afford for your gear to get wet. Obviously, ideally, we never want anything inside of our boat, any part of our gear to get wet, but it can happen, and sometimes it is vital that it doesn't happen, but sometimes you really don't care. For example, if you're going canoeing in early spring when it's cold, when the nights are cold and you know you're gonna have to sleep on the bank of the river, that's a situation where you cannot afford your sleeping items to get wet. But if you're canoeing in the height of summer and you know from the forecast that there's going to be 3 really hot days, then it's not that crucial. If something, I don't know, some part of your clothing gets wet or something like that happens, then you can dry it out. But you have to really know where you're going, what conditions are you going to be in. In the situation we're going, in the summer trip, we might not need so much extra waterproofing, but in this spring trip where we're gonna be cold, we might take like extra care to ensure our stuff doesn't get wet. I'm speaking from my own experience. Our first canoe trip was in mid-May when we had cold nights, and basically all of our stuff got wet, and at the time I was such a beginner, like most of my clothing was cotton and it got wet. And if we didn't have friends from we could borrow some extra clothes, then we would have had to cancel our trip. So another thing to consider when loading your canoe is that will there be many situations where you have to carry your boat across obstacles, as in you have to go on land, unload your boat, carry your boat across the obstacle, and then reload your canoe and then continue on. This can happen when there are like dams or mill dikes or something like that, you know, where you can't just paddle through the obstacle, or maybe there's too much risk involved in paddling through the obstacles. If you know that you're going to have a lot of obstacles in your way, then it means that you're going to have to load and unload many times during the day, and in this case you might consider organizing your items into bigger units. Like, for example, put smaller bags into one bigger bag that you can easily load and unload. So, how to pack the clothing that you'll be taking on the water. Among other items, clothing are the things that we don't want getting wet, and what you should do before your trip is to figure out how many sets of clothing you might need. I always take extra, and if you're a beginner, then I always suggest you take extra. Weight is not the most crucial thing in canoeing, and you can take extra and not worry so much about it being extra weight. So, another reason to take extra is that you might not know whether you're going to fall into the water and some of your important clothing items are going to get soaked. So, if that happens, you should have some extra clothing that you can wear and stay dry. When packing your clothes, arrange your clothes into individual ziplocs. An alternative to this is to use dry bags, but you could also use ziplocs. It's a budget version of doing things, but it's always worked for me, and I haven't bought dry bags. We only have like one, and I think we've used it for our camera. But what I do is, for my clothing, I take this big regular bag that's going to fit nicely into the canoe, and on top of it I have my raincoat, which I might need during the day. Then here's my cap, which I will be wearing, and all my other clothing that I think I'm not going to need during the day is going to be in individual ziplocs. So I'm using 3-liter freezer bags with a Ziploc on the top. I use ones that don't have this slider because I found that the slider tends to tear the bags if it's used multiple times. These freezer bags will hold up for 3 days nicely, and some of these are all new, but some of the ones where my hygiene items are, those are like from last year, so they can hold up and you can definitely reuse them. I've arranged my clothing into sets. For example, I don't put all of my socks into one bag and all of my shirts into the other bag, but I arrange them into sets. Like a set is going to have maybe a shirt, pants, socks, underwear, something like that. That if something happens, I can just take this one Ziploc, open it up, and change all of my clothes. This is important when you're going into rapids and whitewater where you might have a situation where you fall in, and it's useful for that. If it's going to be summertime, I'm still going to use this system of packing, but you know, it's not confusing for me. And if you're using a day pack like I am, I know my clothing is not going to go in here because it won't fit. I'm going to keep all of my clothing in this bag, which is going to sit somewhere behind me. If I think I might need some clothing from this bag during the day, like my raincoat, then this is just going on the top so I can easily access it. So you just think it through, what you might need, what you might not need. So, one category of items that you cannot afford to get wet if you're doing an overnight trip is your sleeping gear. For sleeping, I have here, I've got a reflective foam mat, I've got an inflatable sleeping pad, I've got a sleeping bag and a sleeping bag liner. The foam roll and the inflatable sleeping pad, it doesn't really matter if they get any water, you can just dry them out. These are the items that you should take extra care with when you are packing and waterproofing. What we usually do is pack our sleeping items and our tent into one big, quite thick bag, and we put the bag into a large, heavy-duty compactor bag, and we zip tie the end of it. If you're going to use these big trash bags for any kind of waterproofing, be sure that you secure the opening properly, because it is not going to do you any good if you don't tie them properly and they can still get wet. One way of doing it is to use zip ties or just maybe some string or some rope or something like that, and make sure that it is waterproof. If your sleeping gear gets wet, you might end up getting hypothermia, and that's definitely a situation you want to avoid. So I've talked about packing, I've talked about waterproofing. Now, how do you actually load your canoe? As I said before, this is going to depend on what kind of boat you have, what kind of options you have with that boat, what kind of modifications you might do. You should keep in mind when loading your boat is to keep the center of gravity low. If you have a low center of gravity, it will give your boat more stability. And this is especially important when you're going through whitewater or rapids. It will just help you maneuver the boat more easily, and it might save you a situation. And it might save you from actually capsizing. If you're paddling your canoe solo, then you're going to be sitting in the stern, and my personal advice, I know this is a little bit controversial because there are some paddlers who like to do it differently, but my personal advice when paddling solo is to load stern heavy so that the bow of your boat or the nose of your boat is lighter. It is going to make maneuvering slightly more difficult for you, but if you're going through tricky conditions and rapids, then it might help you maneuver through that. I'm not sure how it exactly works, but if the bow of the canoe is really heavy, and the tail is lighter, then if you are going to, for example, hit an obstacle or brush on a rock that's under the water, it might kind of drive your tail off course, and you do not want your boat going like parallel or sideways to the water flow. And if you load stern heavy and your bow is lighter, then it's easier to deal with conditions like that. But this is according to personal experience and what I've seen people do. There are paddlers who will do this differently, but then again, it really depends on your boat. So this was my advice on how to pack and load your canoe and how to waterproof your gear for a multi-day unsupported canoe trip. If you have any advice of your own, feel free to post it in the comments below. If you found this video entertaining or useful or nice, then feel free to hit the subscribe and like buttons, and you can check out my website. I've also linked a blog post in the description where I talk about the stuff in this video in written form. I've composed it all into a blog post for you to read if you need to go through this advice in a more detailed way. So I will see you next time, and until then, go out on the water.